This cycling hat, translated from my Patreon patrons from a late 19th century pattern, is a quick, fun project with an ingenious flat knit construction. That construction does mean, however, that when the knitting is finished, you'll have to complete the hat by sewing a seam that joins two garter stitch edges along the horizontal grain of the fabric. There are many ways this can be done. In this video, I will show you two, both appropriate to the period of the original pattern. Each has its own merits and drawbacks. You, the knitter, get to choose. For both methods, the preparation is the same. Find yourself a well-lit area in which to sew, and especially if you are new to sewing up your knitting, I highly recommend that you work at a table or desk, not in your lap. For sewing your seam, you'll want any sort of blunt tapestry needle. Mine has a bent tip, but that's not strictly necessary. And you'll want a length of yarn to sew with. Usually it will be the yarn you've knit the piece with, but if you've run out of that, or the knitting yarn is loosely spun and liable to break if used in sewing, pick a yarn in a similar weight and fiber. Cut yourself a piece about 18 to 20 inches long. And from here, the two methods diverge. For horizontal mattress stitch, keep watching. For whip stitch, jump to this time code in the video. Horizontal mattress stitch makes a very strong, flexible seam that works extremely well with hand-knit fabrics. First, take a moment to make sure that you have arranged your work with the right side facing out. I hate to admit the number of times I've been partway through a seam in garter stitch and suddenly realized one of the wrong sides was showing. Now, let's take a look at the selvages. Here's what you can expect to see if you followed the pattern as written, but do keep in mind that even if your selvages don't look exactly like this, you'll still be able to sew up everything perfectly well. Just follow the instructions as they're presented. When we examine the cast-on edge, we see here a column of what look like the little V's of knit stitches. At the bound-off edge, there will also be such a column, although it can be a little harder to spot. Are we going to do our sewing into these columns? No, which is why I want you to recognize them and avoid them. Right next to these selvages, look for the first garter ridges of the right side of the fabric. In my sample, you see them here and here. We will be taking our stitches into the gutter between this first ridge and the second ridge. There's one last step before we begin to sew: pinning. Now, there are many ways to pin your knitting together, but as I am a scatterbrain, I usually use whatever is closest at hand, and that means locking ring stitch markers like these. There are, of course, many other notions you can use, such as bamboo marking pins or wonder clips. See links to those in the description below. But these stitch markers are what I almost always use, because I always have them handy. We pin because pinning helps keep the two edges of the seam properly aligned. When the work is secured by pins, we don't need to worry about the fabric shifting as we work, and we can focus on making good stitches in the correct places. Can you skip pinning? Of course you can. As my late grandmother, a professional seamstress and tailor, taught me as a child, if you wish to take twice the trouble and twice the time to do work half as good, then by all means, skip the pinning. And now we begin to sew. We will be working right to left, but if you're left-handed, you may find working left to right is more comfortable for you. Our very first stitch is the only time we touch a selvage. I like to make one little stitch here, under two threads right at the right-hand corner of the upper selvage. This will help us make things neat later on, you'll see. Pull through, and be sure to leave a 6-inch tail. Next, look into that gutter between the first and second ridges. Look for the first little V on the right, in the gutter. See it? Take a stitch there under both strands of the V from right to left and pull the yarn through. Now, look for the corresponding V in the lower selvage and make a stitch there, from right to left and pull the yarn through. Return to the upper selvage. Find the next V in the gutter. You'll make another stitch under this V from right to left. Notice that the needle begins by going into the same hole that it came out of on the previous stitch. Return to the lower selvage. Find the next V. Make the next stitch. And continue in this way, alternating selvages and moving from V to V. As you work, every so often, pause and gently pull the yarn until your stitches fall nicely into place. Don't pull hard, and don't pull until the stitches get very tight. The seam should just close neatly. And so we continue across, removing pins as we come to them, until we reach the end of the seam. Now, weave in your ends. At the start of the seam, use the tail first to neatly close the gap at the selvage before you weave it in. The cycling hat pattern, by the way, has a tip about where to weave in the end at the brim of the hat. The result is a near invisible join on the right side of the fabric, snug and strong. However, this method also creates a ridge along the inside of the fabric, which some people may find uncomfortable to wear. And since the brim of the hat turns up, the ridge will also be visible when the hat is worn. Our second method is whip stitch. Whip stitch, also known by other names such as overcast or overhand stitch, is extremely simple to work. First, take a moment to make sure that you have arranged your work with the right side facing out. You'll work this seam looking at the right side. Now, let's take a close look at the selvages we plan to join. Along both selvages, you'll notice a small bit here that doesn't look like the rest of your fabric. Many cast-on and bind-off methods create something like this, a column of what appear to be knit stitches. Now, notice conveniently how these selvages nest neatly together. We will be making our whip stitches using these edge stitches as a guide. As I mentioned with mattress stitch, I recommend pinning, and for all the same reasons. We pin because pinning helps keep the two edges of the seam properly aligned. When the work is secured by pins, we don't need to worry about the fabric shifting, and can focus on making good stitches in the correct places. I most often use locking stitch markers to pin. There are, of course, other notions you can use, like bamboo marking pins and wonder clips. See the description below for links. But these stitch markers are what I almost always use. Note that I never use pins intended for securing woven fabrics together. With both selvages aligned and pinned, we will begin working at the right, unless you are left-handed, in which you may find it more comfortable to begin at the left. An important note, I'm first going to show you the fundamental movements of whip stitch, very precisely, and then I will show you a way of holding the fabric and making the stitches that will make it even quicker and simpler, so be sure to watch all of this segment. Begin by taking the needle down from the right side of the work, right at the left corner of the upper selvage, under one strand of the first selvage stitch. Pull the yarn through, taking care to leave a tail of about 6 inches. Next, take a stitch up through the equivalent place in the lower selvage, again going under one strand. Now, return to the upper selvage. Move one strand to the left, and with the needle pointing towards you, bring the yarn through. Then, in the lower selvage, move one strand to the left, and with the needle pointing towards you, bring the yarn through. We continue this way to the end of the seam. One thread to the left in the upper selvage, pull through. One stitch to the left in the lower selvage, pull through. That's how it works, but don't click off just yet. I have some very important advice and a demonstration of how to arrange your work when whip stitching. Whip stitch is most quickly and easily done when you hold the pieces sandwiched together like this, wrong sides together with the seam opening at the top. You can then begin to make each stitch with one simple motion, from the far side of the work through to the near side of the work, always going under one strand, as we've already seen. Far side to near side. Far side to near side. Far side to near side. You see? When the seam is complete, all that remains is to weave in your ends, and you may do that as you would weave in any ends on your knitting. The printed pattern, of course, has a tip about how to treat your tail at the brim edge of the cycling hat. This video was made specially to accompany the cycling hat pattern that I prepared for my Patreon patrons. My patrons make my work possible, and it's my great joy to create things for them. If you'd like to have more access to exclusive downloads, live streams, chats, patterns, and thoughts on techniques, consider joining us. I'm at patreon.com/FranklinHabit. Thank you very much for watching.